Okay, we're open for questions, and our usual policy is to have students ask questions first and followed by faculty. Audrey?
When you talk about the risk of nuclear terrorism and how they compare to the threat of nuclear war, it sounds like you're talking mostly about number of deaths and like roughly 100,000 people. How do you factor in the additional concerns of a psychological toll or economic or other effects from a nuclear terrorist attack?
Well, I think I was taking a simplistic approach just because it's an easy one to show that the assumption is probably wrong, that nuclear terrorism is a tremendous risk and nuclear war is no longer a risk. But yes, both nuclear terrorism and nuclear war have many other factors other than just the number of people killed. What would happen to the world economy? What would happen to our food supply? What would happen to our electrical grid? There's something called EMP, electromagnetic pulse, that we don't quite know what it would do, but it could take out the electrical grid and take years to recover, and it could be mass starvation. Our medical system would come to a halt in a nuclear war, and certainly within the city if there was a major nuclear terrorist attack. So yes, there are many other factors. And so all those I see those as increasing the risk and making it all the more important that we stop neglecting both of these.
Well,
yeah, I'm not wearing my student's hat at the moment here. Thank you very much, Marty, for the presentation. And I agreed with many, if not most, of the points that you made. But I want to take exception to one issue, which is kind of a follow-up to Aubrey's intervention, because it seems to me, unfortunately, that we tend to talk about nuclear terrorism as if it is exclusively the case of a non-state actor either acquiring the material to manufacture a crude but nevertheless real nuclear explosive, or one in which through theft or other means they acquire military hardware, whether they're non-strategic nuclear weapons or not. Mm-hmm. And I think the problem is that it ignores a category which I think is actually much more dangerous, which could lead to the kind of a nuclear exchange which would be of an existential nature. And that's the potential for a non-state actor to precipitate a nuclear exchange among nuclear weapons states.
A catalytic terrorist attack?
It would be, yes, so that's one way. I mean, I think of it more from the standpoint of attempting to spoof the parties into anticipating that they are under attack and responding in kind. And I think it's understandable why we don't pay as much attention to this, because I can't find anybody in the government who is actually seriously concerned about that issue. And it involves not only threats to the United States and the Russian Federation, but in South Asia, one can think of other scenarios as well. So I would just suggest that while your scenario, I think, is sound, as long as you're talking about non-state actors engaging in the direct use of nuclear violence, I think that if one expands this to include the precipitating nuclear exchanges, then we're really talking about existential threats from non-state actors as well.
I think that's a really good point. I actually thought as you were talking, you were going to go to a different place. So first of all, let me agree with the concern you just brought up, but let me bring one up that I thought you were going to that you didn't. People usually talk about nuclear terrorism as a non-state actor, but what if an element within the military of a state decides to use nuclear weapons without permission? And there's Bart Bernstein, who some of you may know, Professor Emeritus of History, one of the premier, if not the premier historian of the nuclear age, calls Dr. Strangelove, the movie from 1964, a documentary. And he calls it that because it's so based in reality. For example, you may remember the American president saying, but I thought I was the only, because what happens, a general goes crazy and decides to attack the Soviet Union, and he orders his bomber wing to do that, and he can't recall them. And the president, when he's told of this, says, but I thought I was the only one authorized to launch a nuclear strike. And General Turgidson, played by George C. Scott, says, yes, sir, you are the only one authorized to launch a nuclear strike. And I hate to jump to conclusions, but it looks like General Ripper, that was the guy who launched, General Ripper, may have exceeded his authority, clearly pointing out the difference between the authority to launch a nuclear attack and the ability to launch a nuclear attack. So I thought you were going to go to the question of what if some segment of the military went crazy from our point of view and launched a nuclear terrorist attack or a nuclear attack. And that's not as crazy as it may seem. Ronald Reagan, who is not a crazy president by these definitions, in, I think it was his diaries, I could find the reference in my computer library at home. Reagan was a believer in the prophecies. This is about the second coming of Christ. He wasn't as far out as the rapture Christians of today. He was on a spectrum. And what he wrote was, I think it's in the vision of Ezekiel, it says that their skin shall hang off their bones in the Battle of Armageddon. It sure sounds like nuclear war to me. Now, Reagan wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons, but he also was longed for the second coming of Christ and saw elements of that, like Israel coming into existence in 1948 against all odds, was part of these prophecies that seemed like they'd never happen. And so there are elements both within Christianity and Judaism, and actually within Islam as well, that would welcome a nuclear war as very small elements that would welcome nuclear war as ushering in the first coming of the Messiah in the case of the Jews, the second coming of the Messiah in the case of the Christians, or I think it's the 12th Imam in the Shiite Islam view. So it is conceivable that it would happen. There were some, the Jewish underground in the 1980s was caught by the Israeli government. Was it Shin Bet that found them, Avner? Mm-hmm. The internal anti-terrorist organization. They usually work against Muslim terrorists, Palestinian terrorists. But in this case, they found out about some Jewish terrorists called the Jewish Underground who were going to blow up the Dome of the Rock, because in both the Christian and the Jewish millennial beliefs about the first or second coming of the Messiah, the Dome of the Rock has to be destroyed and a new Jewish temple built on that site. And so, according to one of the former heads of Shin Bet in the Gatekeepers, in that documentary, he says that this was a demolitions genius, and he knew exactly where to plant the explosives to bring down the dome. And fortunately, they apprehended these people before it happened. So I thought that's what you might be getting at. But so yes, there are lots of risks. Avner.
Yeah, I have two things that I would like to. One is a question, one is a disagreement. My disagreement is about your effort to what you call the factors and the effort to assess risk. I think that we are really all this effort to assign percentage, whether it's 2% or 1% or 5% or whatever, it seems to me highly intuitive, and essentially you just assign numbers by your own intuitions, and your intuitions are just as good as my intuitions and anybody else's intuitions. We have some maybe intersubjectivity to some extent about those intuitions, but it's not based on any. I think that the whole effort to put probability in the sense that we have cases in the past, based on them we can make some generalizations. We don't have the past as indications, and also, even in the not less intriguing questions of forecasting changes in technology, let alone changes in politics and all that, I think we are so blind to see beyond the opacity of maybe 2 or 3 years what's going on in the world, how the world is going to change. So to think about, the world in 50 or 100 years in terms of today, it's presumption that's based, in my view, on very little. So I think we have a veil of ignorance. We just don't know. And any effort to try to say it's likely in 100 years, maybe not in 10 years, but it's intuitions, but it's not based on anything concrete. So that's a disagreement. My question is,
Actually, I'm gonna hit the disagreement too, go.
sure. My question is, you said nothing about the cyber issue and the risk you see in cyber, and I would like you to, given your background, to have your opinion on two things. One is the relations of using cyber in offensive way vis-a-vis nuclear weapons. What do you see more serious? Because many people think that today, in today's world, is the cyber issue, as an offensive way, is much more serious than nuclear. Do you agree with that? And the other question is even further away, but it's intriguing to me. And that's the questions of AI as a possible catastrophic.
Can you hold that? 'Cause I'm 74 and I forget your first question if you go to the third. Okay?
Yeah.
So hold it, if you remember it. So let's take the first one first. First of all, you said whether it's 1% or 5%. That's why I went to order of magnitude. We don't argue about 1% versus 5%. Calling those roughly 1%, 1%.
It's highly arbitrary. 1% or 2% of it.
So first of all, I have this is an argument that's come up, and a friend of mine who said something very similar. Here's what I said to him: if I were to say to you, Avner, that in my opinion, which it's not, but if I were to say to you, my opinion, the risk is 50% per day, you'd say that's crazy, and with good reason. 50% per day meant there's only one chance in a billion that we'd make it through the next month. Okay. So clearly 50% per day is too high. Now if I said I think it's 50% per month, you would also have a very strong case for saying I was being too pessimistic, because then there would only be one chance in a billion of making it through the next 30 months, which is roughly 3 years. And so it's clear that there's an extreme out here that is overestimating, and it's also clear that there's a number down here that is underestimating. So for example, if I were to tell you that in my conviction, the risk was 1 in 100 million per year, I think you would have to say that I'm being, crazily optimistic. That is, thinking we could go 100 million years on our current path. Now, I've said to an order of magnitude. If that's not good enough for you, do it to 2 orders of magnitude. Because there's another important question here. What would be an acceptable level of risk? Meaning that society's complacency about the man in the TNT vest sitting there is not a problem. Even if the risk were 1 in 1,000 per year, okay, an order of magnitude lower than my where I've ended up and where most people end up, even if it were 1 in 1,000 per year, that would be roughly a 10% risk over the expected lifetime of a child born today, because it's on the order of magnitude of 100 years.
Yeah, but I would oppose any effort to put numbers and any efforts to move from 1 year to 2 to 10 years in any way that multiply.
So
I think you can
okay, let me try
low. Right now it seems to me, or high, but you cannot say much about it.
Well, I think we cannot say much, but we can say something, and something I think is enough. Another question is, if we cannot put a number on it, how can we risk the existence of our nation on a strategy whose risk we do not know?
Well, we do have some general intuition, and some of them are become conventional, accepted by society, and somehow society manage way according to this, but it's not that we have any mathematical way to assess risk. I don't think that it's based on any of that. Okay.
This then comes to another point, which was actually the second part of the talk that I might have done. About 10 years ago, when I first started working on this, well, first of all, what most people tended to say is, look, we've gone 65 years, now it would be 75 years, without a nuclear war in the nuclear era. Doesn't it look like it's working? Well, first of all, while there was only 20 years between the end of World War I, 1918, and actually 21 years, and the start of World War II, 1939, that's first of all the start of World War II in Europe. The Chinese would differ and say it started in the mid-30s. Also, I regard World War II as World War 1.1. It was a rematch, which was predictable based on the Treaty of Versailles. Also, if you go back, what we seem to mean by a world war is a pan-European war. We are a Eurocentric culture. What was the last pan-European war before World War I? Napoleonic Wars. They ended in 1812, certainly the overture of 1812, something around there. So roughly 100 years between World War Zero and World War I. And so the 75 years we've gone is not that unusual. Also, so 10 years ago, I started to try to quantify this, which you, of course, say should not be done. But I was trying to see how can we quantify it. And the first thing that people told me about was to use a 95% confidence interval, which is a standard confidence interval in statistics. And the way, I won't go into the details, but when you apply that here, you end up with something called the rule of threes. If you've tossed a coin 75 times, and it's come up tails every time, meaning no nuclear war in each of those years. If you want to predict, if you don't know anything about the probability of the coin showing heads, it could be anything between 0 and 1. It's unlikely, it can't be 1 because you didn't get a heads in 75 tosses. It's unlikely to even be a half because 75 tosses. But it turns out you can only predict no nuclear war one-third as far into the future as we can see into the past, which would be 25 years. I won't go into the details, but that's basically a 95% confidence interval. And that kind of makes sense, because if you think about it, if we were to project, if you toss a coin 75 times, get heads every time, and you then say, I think it'll show heads 75 times into the future, there's roughly a 50-50 chance of that. I mean, that's only a 50% confidence interval, which is not a 95% confidence interval. If you want a 95% confidence interval, if you want to be fairly confident, you can only predict a third as far into the future, or 25 years. And is a 95% confidence interval good enough where the fate of civilization is at stake? So anyway, then after, I didn't like the rule of threes. Eventually, I learned of an engineering discipline called quantitative risk analysis. Anybody here ever hear of it? QRA. Oh yeah, nuclear engineers. It's not perfect, but it's been helpful.
Yeah.
In the same way, George Apostolakis, who you probably have heard of or know, he was on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission,
yes.
Professor at MIT, wrote an excellent paper on QRA, in which he said, QRA is not a dictator, basically. It doesn't tell you what to do, but it's one more tool that indicates maybe what you should think about doing. And I think we should use it here. What QRA does is it breaks down a catastrophic failure into accident chains. The union of all those accident chains is called a fault tree. But for here, let's just think in terms of an accident chain. And a really good example is the Concorde supersonic transport. As many of you may know, it flew for almost 25 years, from roughly 1975 to July 2000, without any crashes, any fatalities. Empirically, just like nuclear deterrence, it looked to be the safest strategy, the safest airliner to fly. Nuclear deterrence looks like the safest military strategy. After the fatal crash, because there were so few flights of the Concorde, the empirical fatality rate became more than 10 times greater, almost 100 times greater than the subsonic fleet. And so how could you have predicted before the fatal crash that the Concorde was too risky to fly? Well, nobody had done a QRA, a quantitative risk analysis. But if they had, I'm fairly confident that it would have shown that we should have grounded the Concorde. The fatal crash involved, to simplify, a four-step accident chain. There was debris on the runway that struck a tire, causing the tire to blow out. Let's call that step one, a tire failure, because there were a lot of tire failures on the Concorde, and a number of them were from debris striking the wheels. Step two is the exploding tire caused a fuel leak. Step three, the leaking fuel caught fire. Step four, the fire caused a loss of power in all engines and the crash. Now, prior to the fatal crash, there were no fatalities, but we knew that the Concorde had a tire failure rate 6,000% above normal. 6,000%, 60 times greater than the subsonic fleet. Should have been a huge warning light. But only, I didn't know about it at the time, and I suspect.
Very much like Colombia, by the way.
What?
What happened to the shuttle Colombia?
Okay, we can come back. Actually, Elizabeth Pate Cornell, who taught me some things about risk analysis, I describe her as Ms. Risk Analysis. She's a professor at Stanford. After the Challenger disaster, she did a QRA of the space shuttle and focused on the tiles. I won't go into the details. She didn't say they should ground it, but it was interesting that that's where she ended up. But coming back to the Concorde, the step one was 60 times greater probability than the subsonic fleet, tire failure. Step two, fuel leak. 10% of the tire failures caused fuel leaks in the case of the Concorde. It actually was a little more than 10%, 6 out of 57. There were no fires, no crashes. But do you see where we could have started to say that the Concorde might have been too risky? And we actually could have filled in steps 3 and 4 by, very approximately, by looking at the subsonic fleet and seeing how often a fuel leak resulted in a fire. That would be a very gross approximation for the Concorde, which could be modified by looking at the airflow of the Concorde, the sources of ignition, and modifying the probability we just came up with. And then we could look at the probability that a fire causes a crash, and we'd end up with an approximate estimate for the risk of flying the Concorde, but better than just guessing. In the same way, I believe we can use QRA to help us get an idea as to the risk of nuclear deterrence. Not perfect, and actually I think it's more useful than estimating the probability. I think it's mostly useful for finding ways to reduce the risk, because what it does is it alerts you to the early stages of the accident chains when most people are saying, see, everything worked. The backup systems were there, no fire, no crash, no nuclear war.
Well, let's leave our disagreement aside. I mean, I would still disagree with that. I think there is fundamental difference between nuclear deterrence, which is much more than just engineering. And engineering plays some role, but it's psychological, political, all kinds of other things. Let's put it aside, and I'm curious about your views about the two other questions that they asked. One is,
Actually, I just want to read one other thing, which I've made some notes. In the last case, once you have a crisis, what's the risk of it going nuclear? War games provide some evidence, because in war games you have trained military and civilian leaders operating. I'm going to read you a few. I've been keeping track of these because most of them are classified. But Paul Bracken, in his book, The Second Nuclear Age, divulged for the first time Proud Prophet war game in 1983. Proud Prophet was to use actual decision makers, the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to make it as realistic as possible. This is a quote from his book. Actual top secret U.S. war plans were incorporated into the game. The result was a catastrophe that made all the wars of the past 500 years pale. 500 million human beings were killed in the initial exchange, and at least that many more would have died from radiation starvation. The game went nuclear big time, not because Secretary Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs were crazy, but because they faithfully implemented the prevailing U.S. strategy. After Proud Prophet, there were no more over-the-top nuclear rhetoric coming out of the United States, which I disagree with, because in 2004, actually a few years later, someone at RAND, Forrest Morgan, had a report where he was able to get some of this stuff declassified. And he wrote, by 2004, strategic planners at headquarters U.S. Air Force had become concerned that they did not adequately understand escalation risks. An increasing number of war games had ended in uncontrolled escalation, games in which the scenarios called for only limited U.S. military intervention. At first, game analysts assumed the outcomes were spurious, the result of overly aggressive red teams. But the increasing frequency with which the games turned escalatory and the wide range of participants suggested something else was at work. Then, this is 2004, 2018, the proclivity of, this is talking about General Hyten, John Hyten, the Stratcom commander. The proclivity of large arsenals and attendant operational doctrines to produce escalation was vividly recounted by the commander of U.S. Stratcom in July 2018, so just a year and a half ago. Speaking to a sizable audience, General Hyten described, quote, a big exercise that his command conducted that February. Quote, I just want to ask you in your own head, how do you think it ends? It ends the same way every time. Bad, meaning it ends with global nuclear war, end of quote. So there are some data points we can look at. And yes, there will be arguments, but at least we should be arguing about it instead of pretending, as the society is, that everything's fine. Let me take your other questions, and I'll try to make them quicker because we should get some others in. Go ahead.
So, question was about cyber, your
cyber.
view about cyber vis-a-vis nuclear, and then the questions of AI, how the Hawkins, Elon Musk concern about AI is ultimately menace to humanity.
I'll just take the cyber one because it's a little closer to my area of expertise. There's a real problem with cyber weapons. Unlike nuclear weapons where there's a taboo, it doesn't mean it's a perfect taboo, but there's a reluctance to use nuclear weapons. If anything, there's an anti-taboo with cyber weapons. When we have an opportunity to use cyber weapons, we seem to like to use them because they seem to be a non-kinetic way, a way without incurring the wrath of the other side. The trouble with this is twofold. First of all, when we use a cyber weapon, it doesn't destroy itself. It's there for the other side to take apart, in fact, for everyone to take apart, as happened with Stuxnet. It was used against the Iranian centrifuges, and then variants of it were used against Aramco in Saudi Arabia. I think they had to brick 10,000 computers. Secondly, if one of these cyber attacks is more virulent than the attacker intended it to be, it could produce a crisis. It's just like nuclear terrorism and nuclear war. They're not separate risks, they're interconnected. In the same way, right now, I don't see cyber attacks as producing a nuclear level of devastation, but they could produce a crisis that could produce nuclear level of devastation.
You don't think that there are ways that could produce damages many times involved stronger than the Stuxnet and that type of things? I mean, really, infrastructure, damaging elements of infrastructure at the same time, instantly, in a massive and large-scale way. I mean,
yeah,
airports, power stations,
also
transportation.
the economy. 40 years ago, when I first started working in cybersecurity, one of the things I said is even if someone is unable to steal billions of dollars, what if they crash? What if they create chaos in our banking system where there are all these spurious transactions and no one knows how much money they have? Our economy would come to a standstill. It's still a risk. Yes, so there's some real dangers there. All the more reason for thinking in terms of global security rather than national security. We need to get together, and even with countries that are highly distasteful to our way of thinking, like North Korea, we need to start working toward understanding and cooperation rather than warfare, cyber.
But do you think that more attention should be given to those issues rather than the old-fashioned so-called nuclear issues?
No, I think attention. I don't think we should pick and choose. I think if you dig down, really the fundamental question is: can we buy national security at the expense of other nations, or do we need to cooperate with other nations to produce our own security? That's the fundamental question. And whether it's cyber or nuclear or aircraft carriers, it's all the same. It's whether you think you can buy national security at the expense of others. Someone else?
Other questions?
So you talked about reducing the risk of nuclear catastrophe or rethinking national security in context of needless wars, and you sort of gave the possible example of the Afghan war in this context. But how exactly would you define this concept, of needless wars? Because that can be pretty subjective.
Well, let's take each war. I'm going to go to Libya because Obama attacked Libya reluctantly, but he attacked Libya. The stated purpose was to protect the Libyan people from a massacre in Benghazi. More people, the evidence I've seen is more people have died in Libya as a result of the chaos than would have died in Benghazi. Or do you see it differently?
I mean, that would also be sort of a hindsight kind of assessment, right? Because at that time, when you look at the decision making at that time.
Well, actually, we'll come to that in a minute, but that has been the result.
Sure.
Has U.S. national security been enhanced or hurt by attacking Libya? Gaddafi was a secularist. There were no jihadists running around Libya. I mean, he killed them all. Instead, Mali, there's incontrovertible evidence that weapons from Gaddafi's armories that were looted have flowed into Mali and probably other nations. Also, as the woman from Nigeria may know, Gaddafi was providing aid to many North African countries, economic aid, that has ceased under the chaos, and so they're worse off. The other interesting thing is Obama was reluctant to attack Gaddafi, but one of the main cheerleaders was Sarkozy, the French president at the time. I only learned a year and a half ago when a French friend of mine, who's a professor at Sciences Po, here at top political science institution. Actually, he was here. Benoit, yes, you know Benoit. Yeah, so Benoit was staying with us while he did some research at Hoover in the summer of 2018, and he says, "Oh, Sarkozy is under police detention because it's now unquestionable that he accepted at least 15 and possibly $50 million in illegal secret campaign contributions from Gaddafi. What's open to question, but seems reasonable, is that Sarkozy was encouraging Obama to attack Gaddafi to shut him up because he was starting to call in his IOUs. So Libya, there's a lot, there's more that needs to be looked at, but Libya, probably a counterproductive war. Iraq, I don't think we need to talk about. It's almost, with mild exception, it's uniformly agreed that Iraq was a needless war. The reasons given, the WMDs did not exist, and tying Saddam Hussein to September 11th was absolute BS. And in the book my wife and I wrote, there's a section on Iraq, which I encourage you to read. You can download a free PDF from my Stanford publications page. I quote Larry Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, and he says, he helped craft the speech to the UN that Colin Powell gave with the simulated anthrax. He said, "I participated in a hoax on the American people, the UN Security Council. How do you think that makes me feel?" And he describes how he got conned into it, or how he conned himself into it, which relates to lesson 1 from my talk to the Nobels. It's easy to fool ourselves. So Iraq, not only needless, but counterproductive. Let's see, what other war? Afghanistan, we've already hit, if you go back far enough, 1979, totally needless, and caused horrible suffering in Afghanistan as well, plus September 11th in this country. Vietnam, read the Vietnam section of our book. By each of those sections, my wife made me cut them in half. She said I was being too much of a professor, and so each can be read in 5 minutes, at most 10. I quote, those of you old enough to remember may know that the Gulf of Tonkin incidents were the legal justification for the Vietnam War. The first incident did happen, but it was not the unprovoked aggression on the high seas that Lyndon Johnson called it. I have a quote there and a link where you can go actually hear him on the phone. It's from the Johnson Library, so it's from an unimpeachable source, saying, "Well, we were blowing up roads and bridges in that area in covert operations, and I suppose they wanted to put a stop to it, so they came out and fired on us and we sunk them." Not exactly unprovoked aggression that they attacked the American destroyer. Then the second incident, which was the straw that supposedly broke the Lyndon Johnson's camel's back, never happened. And there I quote from a formerly top secret NSA history of the event that says no attack happened that night. And there's more to it than that, but I'll just stop there. What war would you say was needful? Pick one, we'll see. Maybe I could be missing one.
I'm interested more in the definitional aspect of it, because as a way of guiding policy making in the future. So when if you using these examples that you've mentioned and others, how would one construct some kind of criteria?
Okay,
through which
good question. But more than constructing the criteria, why haven't we done a retrospective analysis of these disasters to figure out how to not make similar decisions in the future? The only example I've seen of a nation that's made a horrible mistake like this there may be others, but the only one I'm aware of, going back and doing a retrospective, is the Norwegian Parliament authorized a parliamentary investigation into how it had participated in the attack on Libya. I think 10% of the bombs dropped on Libya in the NATO exercise were dropped by Norwegian jets. And what they concluded is that they relied too much on assurances from allies, and it might have been Sarkozy, and they also said we should have had a red team questioning the conclusion. That somebody saying, yeah, but what if? And they didn't have that. Another thing they pointed out is we looked only at the negative consequences of not acting, not at the potential negative consequences of acting. And paradoxically, some of the things they were trying to prevent from happening were a humanitarian and refugee crisis, which is exactly what was produced. So I'd say doing retrospectives would be a good way. I haven't done that, though, for all of you. Well, actually, I have in the book.
Other questions?
I still get,
Oh,
sorry,
yeah.
go ahead first. I still get confused on what the goal of your presentation is, like just rethinking for what?
Oh, okay. So this is, Les and I get this. We talk to people in Congress. We talk to people about Congress because we're focusing on the American Congress because I have a number of connections there. And then we got some others like Les talking to Tom Cooper. And what several people have told us, in fact, one of them was Ambassador Jim Goodby, who some of you may know. He was saying Congress needs to have something concrete. They want to know, what bill do you want me to pass? What legislation do you want? And there's a tension. Congress typically does not have time to rethink national security at this 30,000-foot level, at this very deep level. And yet, if they don't rethink the assumptions that underlie our national security strategy, we'll never get it right. The good news is, first of all, Jim Goodby, when he heard about Les talking with Tom Cooper and Tom Cooper putting us in touch with Jim Cooper and Jim Cooper getting Section 1674 into the NDAA, Jim Goodby said, you know, I'm going to reconsider whether just talk might not work. I mean, because that was talk on Les's part that made that happen. But the good thing is, I think there are actions that can be can be helpful. They're somewhere between just rethinking national security and a specific legislation. This National Academy study is a good example. It's very concrete. It is a study. It's something that congressman and congresswoman can do. But it doesn't change policy. I was talking to a congresswoman, in fact, afterward about this, and she said, oh yeah, studies are the easiest thing for us to get into legislation because it doesn't really change anything. But it does change things. It changes the environment, and it gives, and it produces an asset that, if it's a good asset, can be used for hearings, for media coverage to help change the country's attitudes about these issues.
So my question is, so yeah, I agree that like human beings cannot make a progress without any new idea and so on, but whether it would be possible to reblur the concept of deterrence because it entails a risk.
Whether it be possible to what?
Like that kind of, you want to like blur the concept of the deterrence, right?
Blur it? No.
I cannot describe how it is, but
I want to question whether we can depend on nuclear deterrence ad infinitum. Like James Schlesinger, in an interview in the Wall Street Journal, said, he was talking about the Schultz-Perry-Kissinger Nunn Initiative and how ridiculous it was to envision a world without nuclear weapons. And he said, I think we're going to depend on nuclear deterrence into the foreseeable future, in fact, more or less ad infinitum. Well, can we depend on nuclear deterrence ad infinitum? I'm convinced we can't. Each of us can form our own opinion on that. By the way, while we might disagree on putting numbers on it, I think we agree that it's not something we should depend on ad infinitum.
so still many countries believe that deterrence is helpful, like to prevent the major conflict between the major powers. While if that goes, then the U.S. can be involved in more minor conflict with many countries and more with these.
Well, part of it is you have to think in terms of state transitions. What I've said, I forget whether I say it, I've said it many times, I forget which places. the people who say that nuclear deterrence works and say there's no way World War III could happen are right in one sense. If we're in a safe state in the world, like we probably are today, we cannot jump discontinuously to World War III. But it's possible to make a number of state transitions. Like that's why Cuban Missile Crisis is such a good one to study. There were a sequence of mistakes that were made, and I've identified 5 or 6 key ones. And it took us from a safe state to the brink of the nuclear abyss, and fortunately we did not cross it. In the same way, people who say that a world where the nuclear risk is at an acceptable level, maybe zero, are correct in saying it can't happen. It can't happen from the current state that we're in. But if we change the state of the world bit by bit, things that were previously inconceivable become inevitable. It's like, and miracles do occur. Most of you are too young to remember Gorbachev coming to power. But I would never have dared predict in 1983 or 1984, he came to power in March 85, that someone, a chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, would lift censorship a couple of years later, encourage openness, and go one better than Abraham Lincoln and not shed blood to keep the Union together. Never would have predicted it. But there's a sequence of steps that led to that, and I have some theories about what happened in the Soviet Union, but I won't get into that here. So we need to think in terms, instead of I described the problem as we tend to look at our feet. We look at where we are now and not where we would be if we took a step in the right direction and another step and another step. And we can assess, we have to assess at each point and see whether the world is safer or more dangerous.
Shrod, you have a question?
So you discussed the idea of nuclear diplomacy using a couple of case studies from last couple of administrations. So again, definitely.
Oh, North Korea
Right,
example, yeah.
right.
Or the lack of nuclear diplomacy.
Right. So which could be relevant to North Korea, Iran, some other cases as well. So again, so what is the sort of the low bar of nuclear effectiveness, or
What is the low?
or what are the different ways through which you would understand nuclear effectiveness? Is it an actual agreement? Is it implementation? How long an agreement survives? Or perhaps relevant in the present day context, is it simply talking? Is that itself an achievement in and of itself?
I think the first key step has to be for the American public to realize that what we're doing is extremely dangerous, and that this is right now, you may remember Clinton saying in the 1992 election, it's the economy, stupid. People vote based on the economy. And they don't vote based on foreign policy, military policy. When I talk to people in Congress, I tell them, I'm not proposing you make this a campaign issue because the public doesn't care. But this would be the first step. So like if this National Academy study concludes that the risk is quantifiable, which is it might not, and if it concludes that it's in the range of at least on the order of 1% a year, or at least on the order of even a tenth of 1% a year, and possibly on the order of 1% a year, and that an acceptable risk would have to be somewhere on the order of 10 to the minus 6 per year or lower, then it's something, man in TNT vest is better. It's a way to get across to the public that this is a life and death issue. I'll put it in perspective. About 20 years ago, when I was on the advisory board of an information security, a cybersecurity company, a new executive came on, and he said, so what are you interested in besides cybersecurity? I said, let me put it this way. What would you do if I told you that there was an uninsurable risk that had roughly 10% chance of destroying all shareholder value in this company over the next decade? That got his attention, because he was putting his whole life into making this company worth something. 10% risk of destroying all shareholder value over the next decade, that would be horrible. He said, I want to know what it is so I could try to reduce it. What is it? So I told him it's nuclear weapons. I went through the order of magnitude. And it puts it in a context. I mean, it's much more than just all shareholder value in that company, but it puts it in a context that they can get a hold of. And I think until the public gets a hold of the fact that our current policies are putting their lives at risk, their children at risk, their grandchildren at risk, nothing meaningful will happen. That's the first key step, which is why 10 years ago I started that website that Jim Cooper happened to stumble across.
Any other questions?
The U.S. defense community and national security as a whole seems to be focusing quite a big degree on these great power relations, especially in the context of China and Russia, etc. I just wonder to what extent does this rethinking on national security take into account multipolarity, the fact there's 9 nuclear states with various interests and perceptions, and nuclear technology and NT3 technology at various stages. What are the risks of accidental, inadvertent escalation or nuclear warfare versus the traditional kind of Cold War deterrence kind of theories? Thinking here again, cyber. Some colleagues mentioned AI as well, and potential deep fakes and non-nuclear states and proxy states and terrorists having.
Well, multilateral makes it much more difficult, but also the fact that the United States thinks every part of the world is of vital importance to our national security is a problem. And so I would actually focus on looking at the question, what are our vital national interests? And what are our, taking Russia as an example, because Russia is the only other nation with a comparable nuclear arsenal. What are our beefs with Russia? The biggest one right now would have to be Ukraine and Crimea. And yet, if you dissect that, it's my belief that our encouraging NATO membership for Ukraine actually helped produce the situation that we have. Just like Georgia, 2008, Bush was encouraging Georgia, he was saying Georgia is going to become a member of NATO. And Russia, rightly or wrongly, had made it clear that Georgia and Ukraine were special cases. And if they came into NATO, they were not going to let them come into NATO at any cost. And so in the case of Georgia, by the way, it wasn't just that Russia attacked Georgia for no good reason. I mean, there was some of that. But an EU investigation headed by Heidi Tagliavini concluded that the proximate cause, in her words, of the Georgian War of 2008 was an attack by Georgian troops on, I can't pronounce the capital of South Ossetia. Can somebody pronounce it for me? Tiflis? T-S, it doesn't have enough vowels in it.
Tiflis?
What?
Tiflis? You mean?
No, it was the capital of South Ossetia. And the Georgia, Saakashvili, emboldened by promises of NATO membership and American alliance, felt he could attack South Ossetia and take it back by force without Russia coming in. He was wrong. And so that war is not the only reason, but America's encouragement of Georgia and Saakashvili's recklessness. So by the way, with Saakashvili being reckless, I was giving some lectures at a local retirement community. There were people very interested in these issues. And someone there said, I have a friend who worked with Saakashvili, the president of Georgia at the time, to try to reform the judiciary. And would you like to have him come talk? I assumed he would be an ally of Saakashvili's. But I said, sure, it would be interesting to hear another perspective and see and try to get it, where we might differ, where we might agree. So he comes in, and I start out by saying, well, I see Saakashvili as having been reckless in his actions. You probably see it differently. He said, no, I see it exactly the same way. It doesn't mean he's right, but that's an example. We need to think about where by trying to help nations, we might actually be hurting them. And the Malaysian airline is another example. Right now, it's kind of fallen out of favor. It's more the Iranians shooting down the Ukrainian airliner these days. How many of you know that America shot down an Iranian airliner in 1988? How many of you did not know that?
Everybody.
Iran Air 655. An American Aegis cruiser, the Vincennes, Captain Will Rogers, shot down this airliner, killing a couple hundred people on board.
Slightly more than in the Ukrainian aircraft over Iran.
Yeah. So it's not to forgive the Iranians for shooting down the Ukrainian airliner or any of these other tragedies, but we need to see it more clearly that this is the consequence of flying airliners in war zones, and that if we create war zones needlessly, then we are creating needless risk, and especially if we fly these airliners there. And so, by the way, in the case of Iran Air 655, Ronald Reagan, I think it was on the White House lawn right after, said this was totally different from KAL 007, which I think most of you have heard about, the Korean airliner shot down by the Soviets early in Reagan's presidency, when he said this proves the Soviets are just heartless, inhuman beasts. This was totally different. We shot down the Iranian airliner when it was on a course that was descending, that made it look like it was attacking, except it later turned out it was ascending, and its transponder was supposedly not on the commercial airliner frequency, but it was. And it later turned out that Captain Will Rogers and his ship had a reputation as robo-cruiser within that fleet. And there's even more, but I won't go into. And so again, this is not to tar the United States as uniformly bad or uniquely evil, but we need to stop seeing other nations in that way and start to see it as a natural consequence of our current mentality. Should we stop here?
If nobody has any further questions?
And we'll stick around informally.
Yeah, so I was gonna say, would you stick around for a few minutes for questions? So thank you very much. Let's thank our speaker.